You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 4th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio.
How seriously is China really taking Donald Trump's trade war? Why is it so hard for certain politicians to get off the stage? And does anyone fancy a city break in Pyongyang? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Latika, Bourke and Brant will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Sweden's ambassador to Finland, a more complicated posting than it might once have been. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I'm joined today by Latika, Bourke, writer-at-large for the Australian journal The Nightly, and Brant, the BBC's former China correspondent. Hello to you both.
Hi.
G'day.
Thank you for that authentically Australian greeting, Latika.
Just for you, Andrew.
We are speaking each other's language. You have returned from Brussels. Is that where you got that hat? Listeners, she is wearing a hat which has ears on it.
Are we allowed to mention brand names?
Go ahead.
It's a Karl Lagerfeld hat, and in my alt life I identify as a cat, so Today I'm having one of those days.
So you're wearing a cap. Those are cat's ears?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it could be open to interpretation, but for me, I'll be a cat. Anyway, yes, return from Brussels. It's the first time I've ever taken the Eurostar to Brussels. Andrew, it's a dream. Why does anyone fly? Well, because the tickets are usually £300. But if you take the Eurostar, I'm now a convert. I want to go every other day to Brussels just on the Eurostar because it's so easy.
It does save, whether you are going to Brussels, Paris or wherever else it goes, an awful lot of stuffing about relative to flying. But as you correctly point out, one does pay for it.
They do. But I was in Brussels for the Delphi Economic Forum, a forum you and I go to, obviously, in Delphi each year. Very interesting Brussels forum, actually. And I think one of the most interesting points I picked up during the day was a gentleman from the Marshall Fund, of course. Trump just dominated every conversation, even the topics that weren't about America or Trump. And he said, I think what you're seeing in the United States play out is a civil war of the elites. And I thought that was probably the lesson of the week.
Well, those almost always go really well for everybody else. Robin, speaking of which, and we were talking about this just before the show, and it kind of descended on me like a ton of bricks in that I was asking you what you had been up to lately. You said you'd been Washington, D.C. for the inauguration, and my initial thought was, we can't really talk about that. That was months ago. It was
15 days.
Oh, God, 4 more years. It literally does feel like something that happened ages and ages and ages and ages ago. You said you were there for the inauguration. I'm assuming that's not at the invitation of the inauguree, if that even is a word.
No, it was there to meet some people who are, on the UK side, both diplomatic and on the corporate side, preparing for the onset of Trump 2.0, trying to work out what it means for the UK economy, trying to work out what it means for the global economy. But the reason I feel it feels so distant, isn't it? Because there's the intense pace at which he has gone at it in the days since. And not only are we seeing that kind of ream of executive orders, the trade war on multiple fronts, but a brewing constitutional crisis as well for some in the US about the legalities around which the president can simply say, the Department for Education possibly gone in a couple of weeks' time. So there's that side to it as well.
Well, I'm glad you queued that up because we're going to start with the latest iteration of US President Donald Trump's trade war with absolutely everybody. Having backed down, at least for the moment, from confrontations with Mexico and Canada after both countries solemnly promised, with commendably straight faces, to do things they were doing anyway, Trump appears to be engaged on the China front after Beijing responded to US tariffs with a reminder that this is a game that two can play. While Trump has tariffed everything from China at at 10%. China is being a little more specific in its retaliation, targeting American fossil fuels, tractors, pickup trucks, and some cars. Robin, this is nonsense from China, really, isn't it? They are selecting things that they don't really actually buy much of. They've tariffed 12% of Chinese imports from the US in total.
Yeah, if you're being charitable to Beijing, who, remember, has had a lot more time to prepare for the onslaught, and of course, not just in terms of how they might retaliate, but also in terms of the mechanics of the economy now. We've seen elements of decoupling and de-risking and stepping away from a reliance on the US since that first Trump administration, which is almost now 10 years ago. So the environment is a very different one for those in Beijing. You know they're serious when they go for the soybeans, when they go for the sorghum. I mean, that's $20 billion worth of trade, just those two crops. The fact they're going for big kind of Ford F-150 trucks, of which there aren't that many in China, tells you a lot about the tactics behind this. There remains a significant amount of headroom, and the Chinese, as always, know that the president is a deal maker. They had to retaliate. It's different in terms of what the machinations have been with both Canada and Mexico, but clearly there is room here for a negotiation, for some kind of deal to be done.
Well, do we imagine then, Latika, that at some imminent juncture Xi Jinping is going to have a phone call with Donald Trump in which Xi will solemnly promise to do something that China was already doing, at which point the whole matter will be dropped and Trump will claim a great victory?
Well, if we look at the template of what's happened with Canada and Mexico, yes, you'd be betting on that outcome for sure. And it does, or rather suggest there's a lot of window dressing and pantomime going on here, but boy, it's at a huge cost, isn't it? I mean, ratcheting the stakes up this high doesn't leave a lot of room for error. One thing I will say, though, is yes, China's gone after some fairly minimal sectors, but they are opening a probe into Google, an antitrust investigation into Google, hilariously reporting this to the WTO, which, as an Australian that has had a lot of economic coercion against it during the COVID pandemic, is rather laughable. But so I don't think it's entirely that they are not taking it seriously, because tech is clearly the sector that the United States and this Trump administration is very clearly backing. Now, maybe that's going to be more limited to Elon Musk's tech interests, or maybe it will be Mark Zuckerberg, the new convert and zealot for MAGA, maybe less Google, but I think tech is a sector that the Trump administration so far has shown it is interested in protecting.
Robin, in many respects, there's nothing much, apparently, at the risk of tempting fate, terribly new with what Donald Trump is doing. I mean, as we've been saying, this is what he's always done. You create the crisis, you solve the crisis, you then claim credit. But is that what China, do you think, will have taken away from his first administration? They've been through this once before, and obviously where China's concerned, it's not like there's anybody different in charge of the place, because nobody different is ever in charge of the place. So what do we think Xi Jinping learnt from the first Trump term? You're
right, there's a different Prime Minister. It's Li Qiang now, but it's pretty much the same people. What they learnt is you can allow him to be chaotic, you can allow him to define the parameters of success, and you can allow him as well to then say, well, this is a success. As I alluded to before, they've had much more time to prepare, and the economic relationships now are quite considerably different. There are two things, though, I think, which we do need to talk about, which is appearing in Paris 2 and Paris 3 in some of the reporting. This is further Chinese restrictions on the export of those key minerals, the EMs, so to speak, that go into so many of the things that we're all sitting here using. That continues to be hugely concerning for many on the US side in terms of supply chain security. And also on the more retail politics side, President Trump also went for the retail operations of Shein and Temu, those huge Chinese e-commerce giants, sending stuff here to the UK, everywhere else in the world, particularly in the US, and managing to get away with not paying for the people buying it any tax, because there was a loophole. You can import stuff up to $800 a day and not pay any tax on it, not have to declare it. That was a real to the benefit of Temu and to Shein, and pretty much allowed them to go on to sell on such a huge scale. He's now shut that down, and that's quite significant. These are big operators in China. They're a big part of what ordinary American voters and consumers see in terms of their interactions with China. And moving against that, I think, is quite a clever piece of policy. politics.
I mean, Latika, if we do the thing which I guess we should always do of examining the idea as a thing in itself rather than judging it by who is actually propounding or advocating it, is there anything necessarily wrong with Western countries, Western democracies being less economically reliant on China than they once were?
No, but I'm not sure that's the actual outcome that Donald Trump is setting out to achieve. And I think there's now a growing body of evidence or some suggestions that actually Trump is maybe not a China hawk. Maybe in that first administration it was the Mike Pompeos, the Matthew Pottingers, the Robert O'Briens that were tacking onto a very insecure, unsure Trump in his first iteration. A lot of this hawkishness, which we now come to associate with Donald Trump, but wasn't actually really Donald Trump's worldview. And I think there's every potential that this is the firing gun for a sit-down where potentially you see Trump, you see Xi and maybe Putin carving up some spheres of influence and then agreeing to go their own ways. That I don't think necessarily leads to a complete delinking or decoupling, as some of those extreme Republicans have advocated in terms of economic terms. I think that is a more sober assessment and a more realistic assessment. And that's a real challenge for MAGA land, in my view, because there are a lot of people who want a much clearer split from China than if that's what were to eventuate.
Well, just as a final thought on this, Robin, and an extension of that, as somebody who saw saw the world as China sees it, because that was your job when you were reporting from Beijing. Do you sense anything different in what we have seen in the 6 months that have been crammed into these last 2 weeks in Donald Trump's approach versus the first time? Do you think to the extent that you can never ask anybody to explain what Donald Trump is thinking, do you think his views on China have changed at all?
I think he's much more organised, and this is a transactional politician, and being more organised and being more focused in what he apparently wants to achieve will affect the outcomes. I mean, it's an interesting point just made. Robert Lighthizer, who was an inspiring figure within the previous administration in terms of being very hawkish on China, in terms of trying to change China's approach to the world in terms of access to its economy, in terms of how it interacted with other economies. He's not in this administration. Other acolytes like him are there, but he is not there. I think the important point in this is that the relationship between Beijing and between Washington, and frankly the relationship between Beijing and lots of other parts of the world, has changed very significantly and continues as well to go along a trend of decoupling. And China wants to be less reliant on the US as well. It wants to be less reliant on the US for its energy, for some of its other critical parts. And that's something it sees as being key to its kind of securonomics and its future. And that is a trend that's not going to reverse, irrespective, frankly, of who's in the White House.
Well, let's move along somewhat. And for most politicians, becoming their country's finance minister would likely be a career peak. For Norway's new finance minister, it must feel something of a demotion. Jens Stoltenberg, for it is he, has not only served 2 terms as Norway's prime minister, but a lengthy stretch, concluding only recently as Secretary-General of NATO. In accepting this new role, Stoltenberg joins a veritable chorus line of politicians currently taking one kind of curtain call or another, including Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, US President Donald Trump, and former French President François Hollande, who appears to fancy another lash at the job, despite having left office last time with worse approval ratings than Louis XVI. Is it really, Latika, this hard for people to walk away from?
I think retro politics is here, right? And I wonder if it's got anything to do with the fact that we're always bemoaning, why can't we see good people entering politics? Why isn't, there 10 Rishi Sunaks all leaving the private sector and wanting to go into politics? I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but maybe this is one of the reasons why we're having this kind of call up from the retirement, hey, would you come back and put the baggy green on? Speaking your language,
yes,
Andrew.
That was a cricketing reference for bewildered listeners from the non-cricketing realms. But just to follow that up, Latika, as somebody who has interviewed a great many current or former politicians, what do you think they actually miss? Is this a pure-hearted desire to continue serving their nation, or do they just want to be important again?
Relevance, power. I do think, though, don't underestimate a lot of people think politicians are in it for the grift. And there are some of those. And you see the bad examples. Most that I meet are not actually. They could probably earn a lot more in the private sector, but they enjoy doing what they're doing because it is a vocational sort of job in some respects. So I think you can't underestimate how important it is to people to materially try and change for, most part, the better, the country that they're in and the organisation they're leading. I have interviewed Jens Stoltenberg, speaking of the man in question.
Well, who hasn't?
Correct. He had quite a long time. Interestingly, it's interesting to contrast him with Mark Rutte, who's taken over at NATO after him, because Jens was always a very stilted and scripted communicator at NATO, and Rutte is quite a different character in that respect. So interesting to see how he goes as Norway's finance minister, again having to give up his new role at Munich Security Conference.
Speaking of which, and we are attending that, the team from the Foreign Desk next week, and at things like that, Robin, I am always actually very grateful to the former office holders who turn up at those sort of things and kind of hang wistfully about, because as any journalist knows, it's always more fun approaching former office holders for interviews. One, because they're much more likely to say yes, and two, they're much more likely to tell you what they actually think or actually thought, which is often even more interesting. But there's something kind of melancholy about them as well. I always find you just thinking, like, this is somebody who used to have motorcades and a plane and helicopters and armed guards, and now he's just like some dude or indeed she is some dude or dudette with a knapsack, sort of vaguely upset that they don't have quite the same fancy lanyard they did this time last year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always struck by, I think part of the reason that Stoltenberg is returning to the fray in domestic politics is because that 10-year stint at the helm of NATO, he remained so important and still so connected. And that clearly, I think, is a key reason tactically for bringing him back. There was a hiatus away from domestic politics, but clearly he was very much still at the centre of global politics, wasn't he? David Cameron, the former Prime Minister in this country, I mean, he returned to government as Foreign Secretary, which was seen as a very interesting move at the time. He hadn't had great success in the private sector, failed ventures in China, but he brought back huge gravitas to that role that had somewhat been sullied by previous incumbents, or at least that was the view, I think, of Rishi Sunak at the time. Interestingly, when I was in Washington, I saw a former British Prime Minister who is plotting a new life out there. Liz Truss was at an event that I was at. I mean, she still attends, all former British Prime Ministers, whatever their persuasion, have police protection for the rest of their life. She had that with her. But she is plotting a life in the US, very much riding on the coattails of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. And I think that's where she sees a future, both commercially and in terms of having an ideological impact as well. I don't see a return to domestic politics for her.
What condition was she in? Was she wilted or?
I mean, I would welcome an attempt to return to domestic politics by Liz Truss, because I'm cruel like that. But Latika, are they hoping to benefit, though, these politicians? Some clearly are, from the fact that, rightly or wrongly, a certain nostalgia does start to attach to people who were in office a long time ago, whatever people thought of them at the time. And, you hear it now, people starting to think that, measured against what followed, George W. Bush, widely ridiculed though he was, now looks like Thomas Jefferson. I'm old enough to remember John Major being an almost universal figure of fun. And when you consider him, given what the Tory leadership has looked like for many of those years since, you think, is it too late to invite him back? But is this really going to work for Francois Hollande, who left office? And he left office and did not run again because he was reading the same polls everybody else was. His own family weren't going to vote for him.
Look, I have actually retired from trying to analyse French politics. It is, and that's saying that as an Australian who covered the most mental period of Australian politics for 10 years. I'm out. When it's French politics, I cannot make head or tail of what they do. It's insane. But I do think there is a more serious point to what you're saying there. I think political lifetimes have shortened, which means revivals and resurrections can happen, and you only have to look at Donald Trump. I mean, I remember sitting in this studio with you a couple of years ago telling you about an interview I did with Frank Luntz, the venerated Republican pollster, who said Donald Trump is never going to come back as president. 2 years later, I interviewed him again. Okay, I was wrong. Donald Trump absolutely can come back as president. I think these norms are being rewritten, one, because the volume information ecosystem is so overloaded that a lot of people miss what might take people out in a couple of weeks or a couple of months or a couple of years, whereas a politician might have had a good decade in the public spotlight. So I think we are going to see figures increasingly move in and out of political life like this. I think this is actually going to be a new norm.
Just one thing, can I add that? I mean, Tony Blair is an interesting example, isn't he? For commercial gain, he has stepped out of elected party politics, and for a long time now has been doing his own thing. And the Tony Blair Institute is kind of gaining in influence and gaining in power week by week in terms of its role advising some foreign governments and more generally in think tank world as well. Of course, the return of a Labour government here in the last 6 months has been hugely important as well. We're seeing the return of Peter Mandelson. We're seeing an important influence of roles of people within the UK government here who are close to Tony Blair's way of thinking, and so it's clear that his influence in terms of the Labour movement, but much more broadly on our politics, remains just as significant, I think, and there's no hint of him returning to elected party politics at all.
See, finally on this, Latika, I'm going to dare you to talk me out of a bet I have not placed yet, but am going to place, that at the next general election in this country, the leader of the Conservative Party will be Boris Johnson.
Ooh, that's a very good bet. No, I would encourage you to place that bet, actually.
Okay.
I've always thought Boris Johnson will have a big revival.
Except now that I have said that out loud in this influential forum, the odds are tanking as we speak. I'd better be quick.
Well, why don't we bet? An Aussie red or?
Okay. Are you betting against my proposition?
You took the bet first, so yeah, okay. All right.
Okay, sold.
All right. Aussie red.
We will come back to that when the bet is settled, one way or the other. But now to Greenland, which is reportedly experiencing at least one beneficial consequence of US President Donald Trump's barely disguised threats to dispatch the 82nd Airborne to seize the capital of Nuuk and perhaps rename it Eric. There has been an uptick in inquiries from potential tourists hoping to visit it prior to the installation in downtown Eric of a vast gold statue of the portly liberator who has spent months fulminating that Greenland should be an American fiefdom. In very vaguely related news, North Korea has announced that it will admit tourists once more, having locked them out at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Robin, what we're talking about here is the prospect of tourism in geostrategically significant and perhaps somewhat risky places. Greenland, North Korea, are you tempted by either? Did you, in fact, ever get to North Korea while in China?
No, I would have liked to have gone. I had colleagues who went, most of them crossing up in Dandong, which just northeast of the capital, Beijing. But by the time I got to China for the BBC, some of my colleagues had been detained whilst trying to leave the country, and relationships between the North Korean regime, and let's remember, it is a wicked, evil regime, and the BBC had descended to a very low point. So I think since that, none of my BBC colleagues at the time were allowed to go. Look, I think Greenland is a good example of no news is bad news, and to that extent, it's good for Greenland's economy and the few thousand people that live there. I think North Korea, frankly, is far more sinister. I think this is about foreign currency. It's about an attempt to paint a picture of a country that is so far from what reality is really like in parts of that country, a country that still imprisons tens of thousands of people in labour camps. And remember, when I was researching briefly this story, it talks about sea cucumber farms. I think it talks about, the potential cost, 600-700 euros. At the very end of the piece that I looked at, it talks as well about Otto Warmbier, an American student who went there in 2016 and came back a shadow of himself after 15 months of captivity and then died very quickly on his return to the US. A deeply troubling and a deeply tragic case. And that is the risk you take when you go to North Korea. He apparently was arrested because he defiled, they alleged, a flag within his hotel. But that, for many people who do go, sorry, not for many, for some people who go, is the reality of North Korea, despite this kind of tourism push.
See, I will admit, be absolutely delighted to go to North Korea. I have, in fact, made inquiries into the possibility over the years, but it's tricky, what with it being easily discoverable that you are, in fact, a journalist. You can only go in extremely tightly controlled, organised tours, and as one of the operators of one of those tours said, the trouble is if you take somebody in who then writes something that the regime does not like, then you are very suddenly out of work. The trip that they are proposing now, it's not to Pyongyang or anything like that. You wouldn't get to see any of the mass games, i.e. those great big impeccably choreographed displays in honour of Kim Jong-un. This will only be to a town in the northeast where, as Robin foreshadowed, you would see, Latika, a sea cucumber farm and, I quote, a combined foodstuff processing factory producing various snacks and drinks.
Yeah, I could probably skip that.
So you're not tempted by this particular package or by North Korea generally?
By that particular package. There are so many countries I worry that I will die before I get to go to for exactly this reason. I would love to see North Korea. I'd love to see Russia. I would love to see Iran. I'd really like to see China. But being a journalist makes all those countries very problematic. So actually, I would be completely up for going on some sort of tour if they would guarantee, we won't lock you up when you get here and leave the phone at home, and when you get back, you can write what you will then. That's, I think, a good model. But I think there's a flip side to this. I think there's a lot of other countries that could do this very proactively, and a good example would be Taiwan. I had the pleasure to visit Taiwan last year.
It's a fantastic place to visit.
And the thing that makes Taiwan so fantastic are its people, and that's not really something you can understand or know until you go there. It is one of the friendliest cities, Taipei, that I have ever stepped foot in. And that's coming from an Australian where, we pretty much talk to anyone. So I was really impressed. And I actually had a conversation with a couple of girls in a bar late one night, just chatting away. And I said, what is it about you guys? Why are you so friendly? And she turned around and she said, we know what Beijing says about us. And so when we see a foreigner, we know this is our chance to prove and show you who we really are. And I thought if a lot of countries thought like that, they would do wonders for their tourism.
I mean, I have found in my own journalistic travelling, Robin, there's almost nowhere you can go where you won't meet tourists of one kind or another. I can remember going back to, this goes back to 1998, I was in Kabul. I was the only guest for an entire, nearly 2 weeks. I was the only guest in the Intercontinental Hotel, the sort of bullet-scarred ruin overlooking Kabul, except for one night when 2 French tourists appeared in the restaurant. And I knew they were tourists because I asked them who they were and what they were doing. And they were people on that quest to get stamps in their passport from every country on earth. I think they hadn't got North Korea by that point. Afghanistan, controlled as it was by the Taliban, was one of their last few. But the question that always arises, and I think obviously journalists can't get too snobby about this because we go to these places, is there any kind of ethical or moral quandary here? Are there places you shouldn't go if you're just going on holiday?
Well, look, I was thinking the same thing myself. Is it a price worth paying, knowing that you're going to North Korea, seeing an utter misrepresentation of that country, but nonetheless you can go. There are elements that you can see in that country. You can learn about its people. You can learn about the way it controls its society. Is it still worth going? I think the answer to that on many occasions is probably yes, but nonetheless being aware of the price you're paying, I think, is hugely important. One of the most destructive things, I think, for how China, a huge country in terms of the mainland, is viewed by billions of people across the world, has been the closing de facto of its borders in the aftermath of COVID, and that far fewer people now go there on holidays, to do business, on cultural exchanges. And that is very, very troubling in terms of our understanding of that country. And I think it goes without saying that when you shut the borders to tourists, or at least you do very little to try and get back to the numbers who were going there before, that can only be a bad thing for people's understanding of your country, and the other way as well, your understanding of their country.
I mean, are there places from which tourists, i.e. not journalists, Latika, should perhaps be more forcibly discouraged? I never know quite what to think about.
Italy, I think you mean.
I mean, the Kiev Independent, for example, last year actually printed, and they may have been having a bit of fun because the publication does not lack a sense of humour, but they published kind of a travel guide for wartime Kiev. And the point they were trying to make was this city has not been shut down by Russia. This city is still a lively, thriving place. Things are still going on. But would you really counsel somebody, who has just had a backpack and an Interrail pass to visit Ukraine at the moment?
Look, I think if the Ukrainians feel that they have the ability to cope with people visiting them in the cities that aren't under attack, absolutely. I mean, I would definitely be up for that. And there are huge parts of Ukraine
It's a big country
that are not under attack, and their economy is struggling. So yes, the reverse is true for what Robin was saying about going to North Korea and using a foreign currency. I mean, if you could help the Ukrainians along the way by going and seeing their country, understanding it, and also absorbing what it is like to be in a country in wartime, I think that's an experience that journalist or tourist could walk away from being enriched and having benefited the country.
And also, how powerful is that message, Andrew, that life goes on?
Indeed so. Robin Brant and Latika Bourke, thank you for joining us. Finally on today's show, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, Russia increasingly belligerent, and a slew of hybrid attacks against undersea infrastructure in the Baltic Sea, Northern Europe has emerged as a geopolitical hotspot, something unthinkable just a decade or two ago. Half a year back, Sweden sent one of its most senior diplomats, Peter Eriksson, formerly ambassador to Moscow, to take the helm at the country's embassy in Helsinki. Monocle's correspondent in that city, Petri Burtsov, sat down with the ambassador to discuss counteracting Russia's influence, responding to hybrid attacks, and what the future holds for the once relatively amicable relations between the Nordic countries and Russia.
Peter Eriksson has an impressive CV. He began his career at the Swedish embassy in Moscow when the Soviet Union fell and returned to the city as Sweden's ambassador soon after Russia had invaded Crimea. He has also worked at Sweden's mission to the United Nations, as well as the country's embassy in Washington and Istanbul, and was the Deputy Director General of the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs for 5 years. In August last year, he became one of Sweden's most senior diplomats to be posted to Finland, so I began by asking him if the post has become more important than it used to be.
I think in many ways, yes, but of course Helsinki has always been one of the most important ambassadorial posts for Sweden. But clearly, with the security situation in our region the way it is, which of course prompted our joint NATO membership application, clearly that has made the situation as such has made the Swedish-Finnish cooperation even more important. And the reason the ministry leadership wanted me to come here was my experience of Russia and of security policy. So in that sense, of course, yes, it's these aspects, the security aspects, have become more important, and it fits my background well.
After a recent NATO meeting of heads of state in Helsinki, the alliance announced that it would step up patrols in the Baltic Sea in order to prevent attacks against critical undersea infrastructure. Attacks that have become a common occurrence in the recent year or two. I asked Ambassador Eriksson what he thinks is the best strategy to counteract these types of hybrid attacks, keep calm and carry on, or get to the root of the issue.
I think the latter, getting to the root of the issue and demonstrating that we do not take this lying down. It's very difficult to prove intent in these cases that you allude to, these anchors that are dragging around the Baltic Sea. Partly because in 2 out of the 3 cases recently, it was not possible to have a proper investigation on the ship, and that of course makes the Eagle S, which was apprehended by Finland after very swift reaction from Finnish authorities. I assume that since there are proper investigations by both police and other competent agencies, we might get a clearer picture of the intent, whether there was, and if so, who sort of put the captain or the crew up to this.
Eriksson recalls the sense of optimism and engagement that characterized the relations between the Nordic countries and Russia in the early 90s when he was posted to Moscow. Given that the same relations are now at a historic low, I asked him if we should engage with Russia again, or if he thinks containment is the best course of action.
I think right now engagement is absolutely out of the question. Containment was, in a way, it was a very successful policy. It worked well, but it was also a policy that was during the Cold War, mainly the 50s and 60s. And of course, the situation today is not exactly the same. So we prefer to use another term, but the basic idea is the same. That is to limit or counteract or constrain Russia's ability of influence, room for maneuver, and quite frankly, their ability to do harm to us. And that involves both strengthening ourselves, but also acting in a way that constrains Russia. And of course, the most concrete example where we need to work is to support Ukraine, to make sure that Russia fails in its attempt at subduing Ukraine, and that Ukraine prevails and regains its territory.
Despite being a career diplomat, Eriksson does not mince his words when it comes to predicting the future relations with Russia.
I think there's no way back to where we were. Our relationship with Russia will be tainted or influenced for probably decades or generations to come. I think that the premise that the war ends in one way or the other, and therefore we can just sort of shrug and move on, I think that is clearly not what is going to happen. I think to begin with that whichever comes first, war ends or Putin gets a successor, I think either way Putin's policies and the Russia that we see today will remain. And what kind of Russia do I see? I see a very aggressive Russia, which is adamant on confronting the West, so including the Nordic countries, that is not shy of using military force to try to pursue their political aims, and in general quite a dangerous Russia. And whether Russia is defeated or whether Russia they sort of are successful in some sense in Ukraine, either way I think the future Russia will be quite dangerous and quite unhospitable for the West.
With Sweden and Finland in NATO, the defense alliance's northern flank has grown bigger and more important than before. How should NATO prepare for a potential attack in the north, and what role does Sweden play in this as the predominant military power in Northern Europe?
Russia's war against Ukraine has taught us a number of things, but one of them is that the idea of allowing ourselves to lose territory and then regaining it through bringing in reinforcements from across the Atlantic or from Western Europe, I think that concept, after Bucha and Irpin and everything else, I don't think we would like to gamble on us being able to take it back. Even after a month, the atrocities would be horrendous. Sweden clearly, on a very general level, will have an important contribution because Sweden in practice will become sort of a staging area, and where defense of Finland and the Baltic states forces could sort of gather in Sweden to be deployed to the front along the eastern border. Then, of course, Sweden also has its own armed forces, and in the very early stages of something happening, our Supreme Commander, General Mikael Claesson, pointed out that probably the Swedish Air Force would be the first forces that would be deployed in a situation where Finland or the Baltics are attacked. But also Swedish naval forces, including our submarines, would probably have an important role as well. and the ground forces. Sweden has agreed to become framework nation for the forward land forces to be established in the northern part of Finland.
For Monocle in Helsinki, I'm Petri Burtsov.
That was Petri Burtsov speaking to Peter Eriksson, Sweden's ambassador to Finland. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Latika, Bourke and Robin Brant. Today's show was produced by Anita Riota and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.